You're about to hear a rebroadcast of Where We Live. It originally aired September 19th, 2019.
This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Today's show focuses on the people teaching at your son or daughter's college or university. Did you know 7 out of 10 faculty on U.S. campuses are not eligible for tenure? If you don't work in academia, that number might not stand out to you. But today, Where We Live, we explore the reliance of colleges and universities on non-tenure positions, including adjuncts or part-time faculty. And we hear the consequences of this. Coming up, we'll be joined by a reporter from Inside Higher Education, and we'll learn what's being done to help adjuncts get better pay and more stability. We'll also hear from adjunct faculty working in Connecticut. First, joining us from a studio at The Atlantic is Adam Harris. He's a staff writer covering education at The Atlantic. He's also currently writing a book about racial inequality in higher education. Adam, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
I should mention to our listeners, earlier this year, you wrote a piece titled The Death of an Adjunct. I first saw that shared on Facebook, and when I read about Dr. Thea Hunter, I have to say I couldn't stop thinking about her, Adam. Tell us about Thea. How did you hear about her?
So Dr. Hunter was an adjunct professor at several different institutions in the New York City metro area. But she studied with Eric Foner and several of her colleagues who were in the graduate program with her at Columbia University. Had been passing around, there was a GoFundMe because Dr. Hunter had passed away. And I just kind of, in speaking with some of her former colleagues and hearing more about her backstory, her story and her writing and her brilliance seemed remarkable to me. And the fact that she wasn't able to secure a tenure track position seemed kind of ghastly. And so I kind of wanted to figure out why and what were the machinations at play that kind of led to this point.
When we talk about Thea, before we get into the different positions that she tried for and also the ones she held at different institutions, so what was her track in terms of when she went to graduate school, the type of research that she did? She was someone that people saw as a rising star.
Yeah. So as I mentioned, she studied with Dr. Eric Foner at Columbia University, who's a renowned American historian of the Civil War and Reconstruction period. And Thea, at the time she entered the program, historians were kind of looking for a new perspective on early American history. And it was kind of an Atlantic perspective, right? The kind of transfer of ideas across the water. So from Europe to the Americas and kind of this interchange of ideas. And so she starts to look into this case, the Somerset case, which kind of began with this black man who had escaped slavery for a month, and then he was forcibly taken from England to the colonies. And the difference between his case and several other cases is that he ultimately ended up arguing for his freedom and won his case back in England. And she was able to connect the ideas of freedom and emancipation and abolition from that case to kind of our American understanding of it in the mid 1800s, and Dr. Foner called it, pioneering. Mm-hmm. So when she was entering the job market, she was truly pioneering a new field or a new perspective on American history, and that's one of the reasons why after she finishes her PhD, it doesn't wait too long to find a job on the job market.
And that was before the recession, so she was on a tenured track job here in Connecticut at Western Connecticut State University.
Yes, she got a position at Western Connecticut State in 2004, and she was an assistant professor of history and non-Western culture, and it wasn't too far from the New York area, which was important to her because all of her family still really lived in the New York area, and her mom in particular. So she gets to Western Connecticut State, and at first the job is great. She really enjoys her students. She really enjoys teaching. She really enjoys her research. But slowly there are little things that start to wear on her. You have she gets to campus early, and she's the only person in the building, and she's also a black woman, and she's sitting at her desk, and people will come in and ask her if she's the janitor, or parents will call the school and ask if she has her PhD, and having come from Columbia studying with some of the most renowned historians of the world, it's kind of jarring. So there were these kind of microaggressions and macroaggressions that had been building up over a course of time that just kind of wore on her. And they kind of, once they build up enough, it can kind of beat you down.
You talk about her experiences at Western Connecticut State University. At the same time in your article, you're also writing that over a 20-year period, the percentage of underrepresented minorities in non-tenure track part-time faculty positions grew by 230%. But during the same period, minorities in full-time tenure track positions grew by just 30%. And so I'm just curious, as Thea was experiencing these negative impressions of her, despite her, very rigorous academic background and talent, the long commute to New York, even though she was on this tenured track job, this was not something that she could stay in?
Yeah, and this is actually something that kind of across academe today, you kind of see where professors of color, Black professors, Latino professors will experience these microaggressions. Academe has not necessarily been the friendliest place for minorities. And then kind of given the numbers that you mentioned where, 230%, that's the growth in non-tenure track faculty positions compared to this 30% figure. It's kind of an unsustainable model at this point. So she knows that if she's going to leave this position at Western Connecticut State, it's going to be leaving a modestly defined path towards security. But also, when you're dealing with all of these microaggressions on a day in, day out basis, it can take a toll on you. So one of the things that she believed was that, I have these credentials. I'm eminently qualified for any other position in this area is thick with colleges. So I should be able to find another position. So she ultimately ends up leaving her position at Western Connecticut State.
I'm talking with Adam Harris, staff writer covering education at The Atlantic. We're focusing on a story he wrote several months ago titled The Death of an Adjunct. We're hearing the story of Dr. Thea Hunter, someone, again, who was brilliant by the people that worked with her, her colleagues and friends, and many different things happened in her track that she was unable to stay in a tenure path to a full-time position with stability. And so, Adam, she made the decision to leave this particular position. And so, again, this is before the recession. You mentioned she thought, I should be able to find another a comparable role. But what happened to her?
So after she leaves this position, her friend, Dr. Jim Downs, who's a professor in Connecticut as well, at the time he was on a 3-year teaching appointment at Princeton. And so he invites her, he says, you should apply for this opening to replace this professor, Dr. Colin Palmer, who would be going on a medical leave. So the position would have been to fill that, and then she would have been moving into this teaching appointment that he was similarly in. And during the time that she was in the 1-year appointment to replace Dr. Palmer, things were going great. She had a 1-1 teaching load, so 1 class in the fall, 1 class in the spring. She was able to research and read and write and kind of do all of the things that she wanted to do as a professor. But then once that 1-year appointment ended, she had been moved into this kind of teaching assistantship, where she was teaching 5 to 7 discussion sections, and there was little time for the research and reading and those other kind of things. And then as you kind of move into the recession, that kind of even modestly defined kind of security kind of falls apart.
And so the positions that she could actually get were these part-time adjunct positions, not the tenure track.
Yes, yeah, and she ended up kind of teaching at a range of different places. So she taught at the New School. She got a Distinguished Teaching Award there. She taught at NYU. She taught at Montclair State. She taught at Manhattan College. She taught at a private high school. So she was kind of teaching a little bit of everywhere. And one of the things that she was always angling for this another tenure track position, but one of the things that happens, and this is a thing that her friends were telling me, is when you've done so many adjunct positions, it starts to look like you have a scattered resume rather than you were trying to continue working in academe until you got a tenured position. So the holes in her resume, the gaps in the places where she'd published in her research, those things started to add up on her resume as well.
It almost is contrary to how the rest of the job market and the workforce, when you see people gaining a lot of experience in different places, that can be an attribute. But in colleges and universities, as you mentioned, as her resume held several different positions, that's not something that people look favorably on, Adam?
Yeah, it's more of I think it was described as an odd trajectory, right, where it's not necessarily okay, you've gotten your PhD, you maybe you did a postdoc and then you went into a tenure track job. It's you had a tenure track job and then you moved into a visiting professorship and then you moved into a teaching assistantship and then several different adjunct positions. So what happened along the way that you weren't able to get another tenure track job there? Mm.
And the salary also not something that pays the bills well, Adam?
Yeah, there's a little bit less kind of in terms of on a contract basis. Adjuncts are going to receive X amount of dollars per class that they're teaching or per hour that they're teaching. So it's not the salary, it's not the benefits. You're not going to get the health benefits, and some of those things can also weigh on you too. Because in addition to you having to pay for you're just getting a chunk of money, you have to pay for your health insurance on top of that. And that's just not something that ends up getting rolled into your whole package.
As you reported on this story, hearing about the instability that she faced in her career, the added stress, not having good benefits or health insurance, what kind of toll did that take on Thea?
In emails back and forth with friends, she was kind of saying that she was kind of drained. It was an emotionally and physically taxing time, and then as health issues mounted as well, it was a very challenging and taxing time for her. She began retreating away from friends, and they just kind of described it as she was changing, because it was a very difficult time. She had a dog who she got when things were getting a little bit rough prior to the recession, and her dog passed away, her mother passed away. So it was kind of all of these things that were building up to kind of weigh her down.
In your story, The Death of an Adjunct, earlier you mentioned Dr. Downs, who is a professor here in Connecticut as well. He's the one that got the phone call when she fell ill at a New York hospital. What did they tell him?
So initially, when he received the call, it was a call from a social worker, and they were trying to locate a blood relative of Dr. Hunter. She had written his phone number on the back of, or had written down his phone number, and so they called him, and eventually they told him that Dr. Hunter had died. A doctor had called later to explain what happened to her, and after that he starts calling friends, he starts calling classmates and colleagues. They needed to find her brother. They kind of needed to raise funds for the memorial service, so they start the GoFundMe. But they also needed to start the GoFundMe because they needed to retrieve her body from the morgue. Mm.
In her obituary, her friend, Jim Downs, as we mentioned, shared this, quote, Thea would always say that she had 3 advanced degrees, trained under one of the leading historians in the country, and enjoyed both research and teaching, but could not understand why she could not get a full-time job that would have given her the chance to write her book and to pursue her other research projects. Some who may be listening might wonder, why did she stick with it? Why didn't she just leave academia?
So there are, when you're kind of in this kind of life of the mind, and she was very much a part of that, where she believed that she was doing something that was important. She was following one of her passions. She was also teaching, and she was winning awards for her teaching. So it was, it seemed that, maybe the next break was right around the corner. And then also one of her friends, as they told me, a lot of people they get these advanced degrees. As her friend, Ruth Henderson, who is also an adjunct professor, said, there are these people who go and get these advanced degrees and they're not doing it because they want to do it. But she had this pure desire for learning and teaching. And so she kept going. She kept trying to get that tenured position that would provide her with this job security.
Adam Harris, again, a staff writer covering education at The Atlantic. Adam, before you go, what has been the reaction to that story you wrote about Dr. Thea Hunter?
There's been an outpouring of responsive people who have gone back, and some people have gone back and read her dissertation or read some of her papers. And the next step is her friends have sent her papers to the Schlesinger Library at Harvard, where they'll be included in her collection and or in their collections. And she's the forthcoming editor on a volume with Dr. Downs and two other colleagues. And there's really just kind of been a discussion, and this happens several over and over, but it's kind of there's been this discussion of what are we actually doing to people who we are subjecting to this adjunct system, to this contingent life as adjunct faculty members.
Adam Harris is also currently writing a book about racial inequality in higher education. Adam, we thank you for joining us today to tell us a little bit about Dr. Thea Hunter. We'll make sure we link to your story at Where We Live. Adam, thanks again.
Thanks so much for having me.
This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchil. We're going to continue this conversation. Again, this rise in colleges and universities relying on these non-tenure track faculty positions, including adjuncts. We're going to hear from some Connecticut residents who are adjunct professors, and we want to hear from you too. You can join our conversation. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live.
You're listening to a rebroadcast of Where We Live. It originally aired on September 19th, 2019.
This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchil. Now, if you want a career working at a college and university, the tenure track is the path you want to get on, unless being part-time faculty is a better fit for you. But being an adjunct is hard, as we just heard from The Atlantic's Adam Harris, because of the long hours, the heavy workload, and the insufficient pay. We want to talk with Connecticut residents who are adjuncts, and we'll be hearing from them in just a couple of minutes. I want to take a quick call. Rachel's calling in from Cromwell. Rachel, go ahead.
When I was finishing up my PhD at Rutgers University, I had the opportunity, because I no longer had funding at Rutgers, I was teaching at Princeton at the same time as Thea, and I got to know her a little bit, and she was an incredibly kind and warm individual. When I read the Atlantic article several months ago about her death, it struck me very, very hard. Somewhat also because one of the other people who was in a similar position to Thea as what was recently described as a glorified TA-ship, he also died as well, too. And so it just strikes me odd that two of these people who were in similar positions both died several years after being in them. And I also had the experience of finishing up my PhD and going on the job market for a tenure track position right after the recession began, and was really, after 5 years, unable to secure long-term employment. I had had a postdoc. I adjuncted various institutions across the country and was still unable to do so. And I eventually left pursuing a tenure track job and now work in administration at a university, which I find very rewarding, just for the record. Mm-hmm. But it was an incredibly difficult decision to make. I had not been trained for it as a graduate student, and many of the faculty and and my other colleagues as well, too, really couldn't understand why I was willing to make that choice and why that was the best choice for me, and they weren't terribly supportive about it. So I think that also, my experience might speak towards the sort of larger infrastructural issues that people have about pursuing a tenure track job because they don't know how to do it and they don't have the support necessarily for it from their colleagues.
Thank you for calling in. And again, we're sorry to hear about the passing of your colleague, Dr. Thea Hunter. Today, we're looking more into the fact that the rate of, or the number of non-tenure track faculty at U.S. colleges and universities has risen significantly over the last few decades. We wanted to hear more about what it's like to work as part-time faculty, or to not be able to be on that tenure track where you're guaranteed job stability and better pay. Joining me now in studio is MJ Moriarty, who is an adjunct faculty member who teaches creativity and communication at 3 local colleges, University of Hartford, Manchester Community College, and Central Connecticut State University. MJ, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
When you were hearing about Dr. Thea Hunter, what was your reaction to her story?
Well, it's an incredibly sad story, and I think one that's she's almost like the poster child, I think, of people who go into academic careers these days, particularly around the time of the Great Recession. I think a lot of things changed for people. My story is a little bit different. I think people kind of fall into this in different ways. There's the people who are pursuing an academic career from the beginning, like Dr. Hunter, who are, their whole lives are really devoted to this. And then there are people who adjunct who kind of see it as like the capstone of their career, and they kind of do it for fun at the end, maybe after they retire or near the end of their career. And then there are people like me who kind of stumble upon it midlife and realize, oh, this is what I want to do. I didn't really think about it before, but this works great for me. I went into it knowing that I wasn't a tenure track material. So I just had to figure out how I could make it work for me.
Joining us by phone is Warren Towler, who's also an adjunct professor at Capital Community College in Hartford. He teaches economics and first-year experience, but has also taught American government and African-American history. Warren, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
I should mention you are a Columbia grad, similar to the woman we just heard about, Dr. Thea Hunter, who unfortunately passed away. And we heard a little bit about some of the factors that led or were happening in her life. So, Warren, tell us about yourself and how you got into, working at, wanting to work at a college or university.
Well, was in the corporate world for about 28 years. When the recession hit, my position was downsized, as they say. And after back into my position, and thankfully for 99 weeks of unemployment compensation, my first adjunct contract came the very week that my unemployment compensation stopped. Mm. But in between, I was actually a volunteer at Capital. I was volunteering in the Academic Success Center as a tutor, my first teaching position.
Mm. And so this was something that you started mid-career working at a college or university.
Yeah. Exactly. And I was teaching. My major in college was economics, so that's what I was teaching. Really enjoyed it, enjoyed working with the students, and learned some interesting things along the way about what we call adjuncts, which I call my term of endearment is academic nomads, because we basically go from contract to contract, semester to semester. So there's always a degree of uncertainty as to whether you're going to have classes the next semester or if the ones given you this semester are going to run because of enrollment.
And so how do you get the word out about the courses that you'll be teaching? And because of that, not having that continuity, how do you make ends meet?
Well, I'll tell you what I do. My MBA is in marketing. I start marketing my course to students in the college. I stop by the by the cafeteria, the student centers, and I just network and get people interested in it and spread the word. Then when I have online courses, I reach out to friends of mine at other colleges or people in other areas, church, to talk about the opportunity of taking a 3-credit course over 5 weeks versus 14. And I've had students in my class from Virginia, from California. I even had one year, I had 3 students actually enrolled in a class from Qatar.
And so if you don't
I market it, I aggressively market it.
If you don't get your class filled, what does that mean for how you pay the bills?
Well, that's the thing, and it's an old biblical adage, if you don't work, you don't eat. So if my class does not get filled, there's no compensation. What I learned the first time that happened, I said, okay, I'm going to be off for about 4 months. I went to the Department of Labor to apply for unemployment. I was rejected because they said if the college has offered you classes in the next semester, then you don't qualify for unemployment compensation at this point in time. Mm. So through the course of going through loan modifications and tapping every friend and family member that I know to help me pull through, I came up with another plan last year. I actually went back to school and took the course, passed, and became a licensed EMT.
If you
I do that on the weekends to help supplement.
If you had the opportunity, you'd want to teach full time. I'm just curious about what you would hope to have.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. And I know there's been, at least in the Connecticut system, I know there's been a hiring freeze on, as I've been told, over the last several years, because I had a department chair at one time said, "I wish I could hire you full time, but I can't." And the other point, just a quick stat I want to throw in there, what surprised me. But at our school, our teaching staff is comprised of almost 80% adjuncts. Adjuncts are limited to 8 credits per semester, and seeing most of the courses are 3 credits apiece. That means 6 is the number you can hit. And the compensation, and you need 2 courses to basically survive. But basically the compensation is about maybe $75 a week over what I was collecting on unemployment. So it's a real hand-to-mouth adventure.
We got an email from Kevin, who's also an adjunct professor. Part of his email, he wrote, "Some part-time faculty use food trucks and the food pantry and have various forms of public assistance to get by each month. During winter breaks and summers, most of us don't get to teach. However, the way federal labor law is written, we cannot, in most cases, receive unemployment when we're laid off." So this is no surprise to you from your experience, Warren.
Not at all. I work with a social worker in my town, and I've had access to the food bank, so I've done that. I've had energy assistance. I've had help from my church. I've had just everything to try and keep the family going.
On the phone with us again is Warren Towler, who's an adjunct professor at Capital Community College in Hartford. In studio with me, MJ Moriarty, who's an adjunct faculty member who teaches at 3 local colleges. Mm-hmm. So, MJ, I saw you nodding your head as Warren was talking about, how he's, advertising the class on his own and has another job to make ends meet. Is it surprised? Do you think your students know that this is what adjuncts, this is their reality?
I don't think they know at all. I think that in a way, this is a lovely part of it, is they think of us as professors. And so I don't feel that the students that I have, or even my full-time faculty colleagues, look down on us in any way. I felt like I have been shown a great deal of respect from my department chairs, from my colleagues, and from my students. I feel very valued personally with all those relationships. But yeah, I think that maybe we need to advertise it a little bit more clearly, that there is a distinction, and that we do need some supports put in place so that we can continue to do as good a job as we can.
I wanted to bring into our conversation Colleen Flaherty, who's faculty correspondent for Inside Higher Ed. She's covered this issue of adjuncts extensively. Colleen, welcome to our show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So we just heard for a little bit from 2 different Connecticut residents who adjunct. I'm curious if you could talk about in your reporting, is this similar to what you're hearing from part-time faculty? And how has this practice of hiring these non-tenured track positions really grown on campuses nationwide?
Right. Well, you can't see me. I'm on the phone, but I'm also nodding my head, listening to these stories. Unfortunately, stories like your guests and even Thea Hunter's are not uncommon. There has basically been, since the 1970s, a reversal in job security and job roles among professors. In 1970, about 75% of professors were tenured or on the tenure track as assistant professors. And today, it's basically flipped, where we have about 25% of professors tenured or tenure track, and the rest are either full-time non-tenure track or adjuncts. And we use that word most commonly to describe people like your guests who teach a course here or there. There is kind of a misconception that adjuncts, by and large, like teaching the way that they do, and they teach it as sort of a hobby, or they're happy with one course. But several studies suggest that over 50% of adjuncts would, like your guest mentioned, like a full-time job somewhere. Other studies suggest that they take a great part of their identities from their faculty positions, that they want to be more included in the campus community, and those jobs just aren't there for them.
So when we hear that these positions are increasing versus these tenured positions, strictly for the money, is this why administrators at colleges and universities are going this route?
Right. So when we don't really hear college and university administrators say strictly for the money, but the term that they use often is flexibility, institutional flexibility. They'll say things, they'll say enrollment kind of ebbs and flows, and say that they need adjunct professors to be flexibility within their staffing, sort of portfolios, to be able to let a professor go when a class doesn't fill up, or hire one quickly when one doesn't. And basically it's just that these needs for flexibility make the tenure track less and less tenable for them.
I mentioned earlier, Colleen, that we just did a show about the high cost of higher education. We have universities in our state of Connecticut. If you're going full-time, room and board, other student fees, you're looking at $64,000 a year. Right. So the question is, where is the money going if they're not paying people to work full-time with benefits?
Right. So that's a great question. It's a very complex question. Certainly there has been massive defunding of public higher education, and that, since the 1970s, it's not a coincidence that we're seeing, adjunct employment rates rise as public funding for higher education decreases. But if you want, if you want to link instructional costs to the escalating or arguably skyrocketing cost of college, you can't necessarily do that. Instructional costs have stayed relatively flat for a long time, and some studies put them faculty salaries accounting for only 31 cents on the dollar of institutional budgets. So where is the money going? Administrative costs are greatly outpacing those of instructional costs, and there are a lot of different reasons for that. Student services, institutions competing for each other to attract a diminishing pool of applicants. It's a really complicated picture, but again, it's not. It's the numbers aren't really there to show that college is as expensive as it is because of instructional costs, especially now as we see the adjunctification of higher ed.
You're hearing Colleen Flaherty, faculty correspondent for Inside Higher Ed, as we learn more about why the rate of part-time faculty or adjuncts or non-tenured track positions are increasing at campuses across the country. You can join us, find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. I want to take a quick call. Warren from West Haven is calling in. Warren, go ahead.
Hi. I'm one of the winners in the academic lottery because I got a tenure track job 22 or 23 years ago. And so I hire part-time faculty all the time. And I see their CVs because they write me for jobs. And it's absolutely heartbreaking to see really high-quality people who, and I want to be really blunt here, will never get a line position, will never land a tenure track job because there are fewer and fewer of them. The only thing that's really going to help, I believe, the overall working conditions and benefits for part-time faculty, for adjunct faculty, is not individual efforts to advertise your courses, even though it may be essential. It's to unionize. It's happening all around the country, particularly at public universities, but also at my own. And that helps raise salaries. It helps increase benefits. It helps adjunct faculty get a better look at what their schedule is going to be the following term. That's really I really think that that's the only hope for adjunct faculty to be able to live a life where they can support themselves and their families and have something to do with a profession that that they love and doesn't love them back.
Well, Warren from West Haven, thank you for bringing up that point, who also works at University of Hartford. Our guest in studio who adjuncts, MJ Moriarty, so he mentioned unionization, and that's something that University of Hartford does have. So tell us about, how long ago was that where the staff were able to unionize, and is that something you supported?
Yeah, I was part of the unionization drive. It's an adjunct union that's associated with the 4Cs, which is the Congress of Connecticut Community Colleges, and for me, it's just been in the past year that the union contract has kicked in. So I mean, there's still a ways to go, but for me, I kind of thought it was important to get involved for two reasons. For the principle of the thing, if these universities are really financially and structurally dependent upon adjunct labor, there needs to be a fairer system that put in place. And personally, if I wanted to make this career that I really loved tenable for me and my husband, who also does the same thing, then I needed to kind of, put my money where my mouth was and do something to advocate for ourselves.
Warren Towler is with us, adjunct professor at Capital Community College. He's on the phone. Warren, has being part of a union helped you?
Well, I became part of the 4Cs and became active as a delegate as a part-time rep last year. And the first question that came to mind was, and this came about when I said I was going to go to school to get my EMT license, I applied for professional development funds. The tuition for the course was $2,000. And when I looked at how the money was allocated, the majority of the money, even within our union, went to the full-time faculty and only about maybe 15% of the total amount to the part-timers. And I said, this is kind of inverted. If part-timers are 80% of our rank and file, why such a minuscule amount of professional development funds versus for the others to go to conferences and all kinds of other things? I got a blank stare. But we had elections back in the spring. We have a new union president in the 4Cs. And this is something I want to pursue because one of the things I said is, as the gentleman who said who was tenured a couple decades ago, he hit it right on the head. We're there, but do we as adjuncts know each other? Are we communicating with each other? So my goal is I want to increase the channel of communications within the adjuncts, within my university, within my school, and then reach out to my counterparts at other schools so that we actually begin to develop that grassroots voice that is going to be able to make a difference. I don't think we're there yet, but I think that's one of the tracks I think we're on. We just have to learn to talk to each other, share our stories, get to know what everybody else is going through. And there's so many common stories. It's like, hey, we come together as one voice, and I think we can start to make some inroads.
Well, I want to thank Warren Towler for joining us to tell us a little bit about his story. Before we head to break, Colleen Flaherty, who's faculty correspondent for Inside Higher Ed, we heard about unionization efforts in Connecticut. Is this something growing across the country, and does it help?
Right. So Warren's experience is kind of fascinating because certainly within unions there are some internal dynamics that I have heard about before. Adjuncts say that the unionization within conditions for adjuncts that are in unions with full-time tenure-track faculty are sometimes challenging because full-time faculty members sometimes don't recognize all of their specific needs. But overall, the data do say that adjuncts who are unionized have higher salaries, that they have increased job security. So you're not getting that call, on September 1st after you've worked all summer to prepare a course that, oh, sorry, your job, your course didn't fill up and we don't need you after all. In some cases, they do get some health benefits. So they do have better working conditions. And I would say that within the last few years in particular, there's been a push for adjunct-specific unions on private campuses. The Service Employees International Union is largely responsible for that, but there are other unions involved. And those first contracts are very promising. However, they haven't obviously solved this larger adjunct issue that hopefully we'll be able to talk about later, is also linked to student learning conditions that have negative impacts on student learning conditions as well.
Colleen Flaherty is faculty correspondent for Inside Higher Ed. She's going to stick around with us, but I want to thank our in-studio guest, MJ Moriarty, for joining us, who is an adjunct at 3 different local colleges. MJ, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Lucy.
This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. As Colleen mentioned, what is the impact on this rise in adjuncting across the country on them and the students they teach? We're also going to hear from someone who left academia, and we're going to find out why. You can join us too. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live.
You're listening to a rebroadcast of Where We Live. It originally aired on September 19th, 2019.
This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio is hosting a coffee break at local coffee shops across Connecticut to hear from you. What issue or story in your community is not getting the attention it needs? I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Join me and the Where We Live team at Silk City Coffee in Manchester, Connecticut, Tuesday, December 10th. We can't wait to meet you. Check out Where We Live's Facebook page for more information. We're focusing on faculty at colleges and universities in the U.S. and the fact staff like adjuncts face job instability, poor pay, and few benefits. Do you think about that when choosing a higher ed institution for your son or daughter? You can join us on Facebook and Twitter. On the phone with us is Colleen Flaherty, faculty correspondent for Inside Higher Ed. And joining us now is Erin Bartram, who finished her PhD at UConn in 2018. But last year, she wrote a piece about her decision to leave adjunct work in academia. Erin, welcome to our show.
Thanks for having me, Lucy.
So tell us a little bit about yourself. Unlike Warren and MJ, who we heard from earlier, you really wanted a career in academia. You got your PhD from UConn. What happened?
Actually, just one correction. I got my PhD at the end of 2015, which sort of helps explain my trajectory. But yes, in many cases, my experience is a bit more typical than either of your guests or even Dr. Hunter. I finished my PhD actually while I was in my first full-time non-tenure track position at the University of Hartford. After 3 sequential one-year positions, I decided to leave academia. I had been on the job market each year. I had applied for as many positions as were possible in my field, which was 19th century U.S. history. And I didn't get a full-time position. And one thing that I think is really important, I appreciate the desire to commend the brilliance of various scholars who haven't gotten jobs. The problem is the market is so bad. Everyone who isn't getting a job is very, very well qualified and brilliant. And after 3 years, essentially, there's the idea that, well, if you were going to get a job, you would have gotten one by now. And so I decided to try to pursue other options. The other problem is framing leaving academia as something that's difficult because this is your passion. While true is not the only reason that people stay in the game, getting out, as Dr. Hunter's story shows, having any gaps in your resume makes it basically impossible to get back in. And finding a job outside academia is incredibly difficult, largely because of really unfounded stereotypes that people outside of academia have about those of us in academia. And I think it's important to note adjunct salaries are incredibly low. Tenure track salaries are far lower than the general public thinks as well. The life of academic privilege is not real. The stereotype of what a professor's life is like is simply not the case. And to continue to perpetuate that, I think does a lot of damage.
That piece that you wrote that went viral last year, you talk about how when you did make that decision to leave, how you really felt like you lost a part of your identity because of all of the topics and the people that you studied. You really had this trajectory that it was hard to just let that all go. So tell us what you're doing now.
Well, one thing that's important, even though I decided to leave the search for a tenure track job, it was very difficult to find another position. And I ended up having to pick up an adjunct job. My adjunct is again at one of the Yukon regional campuses, which I loved very much. But I had to do that in some sense because I was going to job interviews where people were saying, but don't you just really want to go back to academia? Which is not only impossible, that kind of constant rubbing salt in the wound, this idea that, you'll just go back. There is no going back. If you get someone there in front of your desk who's a job candidate for a non-academic job, they're not going back. And so I eventually, I'm now working at the Mark Twain House and Museum in a part-time position as the school programs coordinator. And I'm very lucky to be able to use actually a lot of the work that I've done, but it's not my field and it's not my research in any way. And so when I left academia, I was also leaving a book manuscript that I had half written. And I finished publishing a journal article, which I can't actually read because it's behind a paywall. And I left behind an enormous network of people. And this piece of mine that went viral was largely about what academia loses when thousands and thousands of people are unable to find full-time employment. And actually, Colleen was the first higher ed reporter to pick up anything on that piece. I think Colleen's point that you made right before the break is a really important one. And I think it's notable. The Atlantic has published probably half a dozen pieces on this topic in the past 10 years. There's been lots of coverage of this. And I think it's really clear that calls for solidarity with people outside academia haven't worked, saying adjuncts are poorly paid. That doesn't resonate with people who are worried about the cost of college.
Well, let's go to Erin. Let's go to Colleen Flaherty before we run out of time because of that point that she did make at the end of the break. Colleen, again, we're focusing on the human toll that it takes on people who want careers in academia, as Erin said, who are brilliant, but they can't seem to get on that path. The impact also on students.
Right. So the human toll is related to the educational toll. Adjunct activists and allies like to say that adjunct working conditions are student learning conditions. There have been many studies that highlight the negative impact on students of adjunct working conditions. And this is not because adjuncts are bad teachers. Far from it. They're often extremely passionate. Many times it's only their passion for what they do that kind of keeps them in the game for as long as they stay in it. But it's because very often adjuncts don't have office space. They don't have access to professional development funds or, similar access to their tenure track peers. They are rushing from campus to campus to try to teach courses to make ends meet, as we've heard already today on your show. And sometimes it's as silly as not having, an email address that's easy for students to find on the web and contact them. So basically, a lot of research suggests that the retention and prompt graduation rates that colleges and universities are so interested in is linked to, especially in the first couple of years of college, student and faculty interaction, students being able to make close bonds with at least one faculty member. That has a great impact on their ability or their likelihood to stay in college and to graduate on time. And when you have an adjunct who's there one semester but not necessarily the next, or who isn't able to stay after class again because they're rushing to another campus, or who doesn't have office hours because they don't have an office, that is going to impact the student's learning experience.
Well, I want to thank Colleen Flaherty for joining us. It's a good point to end on, faculty correspondent for Inside Higher Ed. Colleen, thank you. Also, Erin Bartram, who finished her PhD at UConn in 2015. She left academia. She's co-founder and editor of Contingent magazine. We thank Erin for joining us today here on Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Today's show produced by Carmen Baskoff. Thanks for listening.